Everything else being equal, I would prefer not to see my fellow Canadians celebrating the recent terror attacks in Israel. Everything else being equal, I prefer not to see people celebrating attacks that included the killing of innocent men, women, and children, the raping of women, the kidnapping of families, and the parading of their victims' bodies through the streets while celebrating. These are vile and reprehensible attacks. And there's been a number of people who've spoken out against the celebrations that are happening here in Canada in regards to those attacks. I've seen reports of pro-Palestinian celebrations in Mississauga, not too far from where I live, in Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Edmonton, and perhaps others. And a number of people have rightfully condemned these celebrations or these demonstrations. And although the Liberal Party in general has been relatively quiet on condemning these celebrations, credit where credit is due. I've noticed at least a few Liberal MPs and at least one minister, as I record this, Minister Mark Miller, has spoken out against these celebrations here in Canada. And MPs Anthony Housefather and former Minister Carolyn Bennett have also condemned these celebrations. This is an emotional time. I know that for everyone involved, seeing these horrific terror attacks and then seeing the celebrations happening here in Canada and elsewhere around the world, including Sydney, New York, I think Birmingham, and perhaps London. There seems to be worldwide celebrations over these attacks. And there's been a number of people who are calling for these demonstrations or celebrations to be shut down. And while I agree that celebrating the deaths of innocent women and children and men is vile, I disagree that these celebrations ought to be shut down. And the reason for that is I believe the cost of shutting them down is worse than the celebrations themselves. In order to shut down these types of demonstrations, and I should say, as I record this, from what I've seen, as vile as these celebrations are, they have been peaceful. There are people chanting, waving flags, waving placards about pro-Palestinian views and seemingly celebrating these terror attacks. So as long as these demonstrations remain peaceful, I think they should be allowed to happen. And again, for at least a couple of reasons. One, any policy that would prevent these types of demonstrations would require some sort of body, some sort of person or committee that would decide which demonstrations are acceptable and which ones are unacceptable. And even if we had a committee made up solely of people of strong moral character, such a committee or body could easily be co-opted, in my mind, and it could be used to silence one's political enemies. And I think the prospect of that happening is much more costly to a society like Canada than actually having to put up with seeing these demonstrations. Second, I don't think such a policy would cure the underlying problem. While it might silence the anti-Semite, it does nothing about anti-Semitism. Now, as a Christian, I happen to believe that the cure to anti-Semitism, as in the cure for any sin, is for an individual person to turn away from that kind of thing, those sort of vile beliefs, and turn instead to what is true, good, and beautiful, and to align oneself with, well, again, in the Christian point of view, the person, ways, and teachings of Christ. There's no policy that can, in my mind, that can cure anti-Semitism. So even if we shut down these protests, these celebrations, it's not reasonable to think that the person who hates Jews, who's out on the street, if we send them home, they're going to suddenly stop hating Jews. Until anti-Semites turn away from their anti-Semitism, I at least want to know who they are and where they are. So I say, let them march in their streets, let them wave their flags, let them chant their chants. That way we can at least keep an eye on them and judge their character by their words and actions.